Welcome back to the Overflow broadcast. It has been a while. Life has been crazy busy, but I am happy to be back and back diving into Genesis. And today we'll be in chapter 4. Chapters 1 through 3 contain just so much information, so much intrigue, and so many questions. But believe it or not, we might actually have more questions here in chapter 4 than we had in the first three. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Verse 1 states this. Now the man, being Adam, had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have obtained a male child with the help of the Lord. So this is the first record in the text of a child. There could have potentially been children pre-sin, as we get sort of back in chapter 3, the comparative of um, that your pain will be greatly increased in raising children, but it's much more likely and fits the overall narrative of scripture much better if this is genuinely the first child born to Eve. And she names him Cain. He's the firstborn here. Verse 2, and again she gave birth to his brother Abel, secondborn. Abel was a keeper of the flocks, but Cain was a cultivator of the ground. Now, I want to bring up the order of birth here because it's going to end up being a recurring theme as we go throughout Scripture, and this is the first introduction of it. But if we can think of some other examples later on, you will have Esau and Jacob. You will have the children of Jacob, which um, and I bring all this up because typically the firstborn is the heir of the household, um, and so we'll see something that does not always match in some of these biblical stories where someone other than the firstborn ends up becoming the heir, and we'll see that even in this story right here. But it's a very interesting building block that'll be picked up many more times, much later in the scriptures. So just put this in your back pocket for now. But we've got the firstborn Cain, the secondborn Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, a shepherd, which again is an interesting recurring theme that comes up throughout scripture. But Cain was a cultivator of the ground. So Cain was a farmer. Verse 3. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat portions. And I want to pause there before we talk about the reception of their offering. And I want to try to help set the stage a little bit more. So at the end of chapter 3, Adam and Eve are banished from the garden. And that begs the question of where did they go? On this whole giant earth, you've been kicked out of the garden, the one place that you've lived. Where then are you headed to? And we don't have any definitive information about this right away, but I would guess it's very natural to presume that they could have stayed very close by to the garden, that they would not have ventured far away. It's not like there would have been a lot of competition for resources or shelter. There's a good chance they are the only human beings really on the earth at this point. Um, and so if you want to develop a picture in your head of this, what I would paint for you is the garden is here. And remember, I believe the garden is, geologically, it's a mountainous area. And then if you just go right next to the garden, I would guess that's where Adam and Eve and their sons set up shop, which then paints an interesting picture of these offerings that they go to give. Now, this is one of the places where we have a lot more questions than answers because we're told that they go to bring an offering. Cain brings an offering and Abel brings an offering. Well, why did they bring an offering? this indicates that there's some sort of religious practice going on already, even though there hasn't been a commandment necessarily from God that, hey, you need to bring an offering to me at such and such time. Um, it seems like this practice was in Kate was uh, already established all the way back here immediately upon them leaving the garden, that they want to bring an offering to God. And there's a good chance, if they are right there by the Garden of Eden, that they're essentially taking it up towards where the cherubim is that's guarding the way to the Garden of Eden, to say, hey, we are offering this to God. And I think that paints a really interesting picture. Before there was ever really law, before there was really organized religion, so to speak, worship of God was still just a necessity. It was still just it was deeply embedded in their hearts without even having to be told to do it. They come and they bring an offering before the Lord. And they each brought an offering from their respective areas. Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Abel brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Now, here is an interpretive challenge. Now, we know, based on the wording here, Abel brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock, from the fat portions. And so we could logically then say, oh, well, Abel's offering was better to God because he brought the firstborn, brought the best. And it doesn't say that about Cain. But it also doesn't say that Cain didn't bring his best, and I say this as a challenge because I think in general you can get an idea that Abel's was regarded because it was the best he had to offer, but it can be dangerous to try to make sweeping conclusions on that too and say that, oh well, offering animals was better than offering grain or fruit. uh, that's not directly stated here in the text. And once again, that's sort of a challenge, because how far do you just lean on your own logic? An easy example, just what I mentioned on the geography of where Adam and Eve ventured to when they left the garden. I mean, these are posited ideas, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're conclusions. You really want to hold a lot of things like this with an open hand and not firmly grasp your own conclusions and think this is absolutely how it was, and there's no other way. Um, but there's absolutely and definitely an indicator, because it's just spelled out pretty plainly, that Abel brought the firstborn from his flock. He brought seemingly the best. Whether or not Cain did, we're not really told, but for whatever reason, God regarded Abel's offering and didn't really care for Cain's offering, which I guess in some ways can go to a broader subject that we won't spend too much time on. But if you think about it, one of the commonalities of the idea of worship today is that, hey, God knows your heart. You just bring whatever you have to God, and God will be happy with that. That is what God wants. That as long as you're trying to worship God, He's going to be pleased with that. And that is completely in contradiction to exactly what's being shown here, because it wasn't like Cain didn't care about his offering. Okay. Cain became very angry and his face was gloomy because his offering was not regarded by God. He was upset. It was clearly something that he cared about. So it wasn't just, I'm going to bring you something just because I have to. No, Cain cared. He cares enough to, spoilers, he cares enough to kill his brother over his anger on this. So it wasn't a lack of uh, desire on Cain's part. There were clearly some sort of standards or some sort of something that God was looking for in the offering that Cain did not provide. And I think, fast forward to our modern context, when we talk about worship, um, I think God is pretty open with different sorts of expression within worship, but I think God does have have some standards for what worship should look like. Um, and this text isn't really the place for a lot of that conversation, but what I'm really trying to get at is here, um, God has standards. Just overall, God has standards, and when those standards aren't met, God isn't pleased. Um, but even in saying that, because this is interesting, when God is not pleased, when God shows no regard for Cain and his offering, God doesn't just say, "All right, Cain, you're out of the family. I don't want anything to do with you because your offering was not good enough." Rather, Cain had become very angry and his face was gloomy. And then the Lord said to Cain, okay, who bridged the gap? It's never mankind trying to bridge the gap, or perhaps there's trying to, but it's never mankind bridging the gap. The Lord approaches Cain and says to him, "Why are you angry? And why is your face gloomy?" Once again, God has never asked a question that he doesn't know the answer to, but this is, similar to Adam and Eve in the garden when they messed up. God approaches Cain and says, "Hey, talk to me about it. What's going on here? What's on your mind?" And then he follows up, "If you do well, will your face not be cheerful? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." This is a very loaded verse of scripture here. So, God's endeavor here, why is God doing what he's doing? God, it would appear, is trying to restore Cain. Cain is angry. God sees that Cain is angry. God goes to say, "Hey, I know you're upset. Here's how we can fix it. If you do what you're supposed to do, if you do what's right, if you do well, won't you be happy? If you don't do well, masterful warning coming, sin is lurking at the door. And its desire is for you, but you must master it." Now, let's have just a little bit of fun with phrases here. Sin is lurking at the door. What sort of house do you think Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel lived in? Do you think they had a house? Okay, and if they did, does their house have a door? Well, apparently so, because God is using a word here in door that they have to have some idea of what it is. And so I think one thing we can sort of gather from that is the advanced intelligence of these people and what they were immediately doing here. If Abel worked with the flocks, that means they were already learning how to domesticate animals and manage them. And if Cain is farming, they've already learned agriculture. One of the things that the theory of evolution teaches is that mankind started as hunter gatherers, and it was, we're hunting animals and we're just picking the food that is naturally grown there. Now, the picking the food that's naturally grown there seems to be life inside of the garden, but already outside of the garden, they're doing these advanced things of husbandry and farming that they're already learning how to work in these areas. Um, but that's mostly an aside there. But then getting back to the actual point of what God is saying here, this idea that sin is lurking at your door, its desire is for you, but you must master it. Sin is not a person, okay? But in this phrase, sin is personified. Now, if we want, we could say, yeah, sin is a person, it's Satan. Okay, the accuser, the serpent that was in chapter 3. But God speaks of the object or the action sin as though it is a being. Sin is lurking at the door. Okay? This lines out the reality that is the human experience outside of the garden, outside of God's perfect paradise. That there is this inward turmoil known as sin that is lurking at the door that wants to have you, that it wants to dominate you. It wants to take you over But then the encouragement or the command there from God is, you must master it. And much of really from this verse on through the rest of the text is the outflowing of this battle between sin and its desire for human beings and mankind striving against that sin and God's advocacy for mankind in that battle against sin. Sin's desire is for you, you must master it. That is the conflict of the rest of the text. Even Jesus, when he was sent out into the wilderness, Satan came to tempt him externally, but came to find that there was no grounds for that temptation internally because Jesus is the master over sin. Sin has no power. There was no pull on Jesus's heart in that sense to disobey his father. Okay. Verse 8. Cain talked to his brother Abel. So clearly, we've transitioned from the scene there that would end in verse 7 of God's conversation with Cain. And now Cain goes to talk to his brother Abel. And it happened that when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Wow, that escalated quickly. Just in the last chapter, we get the first sin, which was as simple as eating a piece of fruit. And then one chapter later, one generation later, we have murder. The second noted sinful act, really, here is murder, which is just completely shocking. I mean, there's this whole big world. There are so few people. And somehow, in the mind of Cain, he decides, I'm so angry that my brother's offer was accepted and mine is not, that I am going to kill him. That's just, it's crazy on one hand. It's almost hard to digest. But on the other hand, we have to read it in the context of verse 7. Sin is lurking at the door and its desire is for you. I think we can easily say Cain gave in to that desire and he did the ultimate thing against his brother and murdered him. Now, one other thing to mention just on this idea of sin lurking at the door, its desire for you and the need to master it is the separation between behavior and identity. So Cain, to this point, before he murders his brother, has not his offering was not accepted, but God was not trying to cast him out. God didn't say, Cain, you're bad. You are bad. No, your behavior was not accepted. If you do well, if you do what is right, great. But you need to master this temptation towards sin. Separating behavior and identity is an incredibly uh, profound thing to do in your day-to-day life. Okay. Um, my son, who is 3 years old, makes decisions that are common for a 3-year-old to do. He screams and throws a fit for very minor inconveniences. He hits me, he headbutted me in the nose last night and it hurts so badly. And these behaviors are not good. Okay, these behaviors are bad, but I would never say that my son is bad. His identity is not bad at all. He's my son. I love him with all of my heart. His behaviors can be bad, and those behaviors need to be corrected, but it's really important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, identity and behavior are very distinct. Now, is mankind naturally good or naturally evil? That's one of those big moral questions. According to the biblical narrative, mankind, our nature is very evil. But at the same time, we were created by God who is very good. And so once again, we get this picture of this tension of something really good that does just unspeakably bad things at times. But God didn't address Cain according to his identity, but rather according to his behavior. However, Cain rises up, he kills his brother, and then the Lord approaches him again. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" What an interesting contrast. Cain doesn't necessarily speak in these earlier verses, but he speaks to God this time. And he speaks sarcastically to God this time, and he lies to God. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? It's not my job to keep tabs on him, God. Where do you think he is? You get this idea of just this rising level of rebellion from Cain. Then he, being God, said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." Now, let's take this both figuratively and literally, honestly. Uh, the figurative or the if we want to consider this figurative language, this is the idea that like, hey, this unrighteous act, this sinful act, it speaks for itself against you. But I mean, even quite literally, this phrase is used again later on in Scripture that the blood of the innocent cries out against those who have wronged them. It says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Remember, Abel was a keeper of the flocks, but Cain, by profession, by his expertise, was in farming. And God's consequence for what he has done here is you are now cursed from the ground. Okay. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a wanderer and drifter on the earth. Okay. So I mentioned earlier the theory of evolution, and a lot of when I say the theory of evolution, usually I'm pretty negative about that. But if we were even to go to a lot of anthropology, the study of human societies, now there's a reason that it's thought that people were hunter gatherers early on, because if you look right here in Genesis 4:12, hey, Cain, you're not going to be able to farm anymore. You're going to have to go and you're going to have to hunt and you're going to have to gather. And actually, I say hunt. That wasn't really part of it yet. But you're going to go and you're going to gather from the earth, which is such an interesting punishment. It's such an interesting punishment because first of all, it's an amplification of the curse that was already given in chapter 3. In chapter 3 it was, hey, the ground's going to be tough now. You're going to be able to farm, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to be backbreaking work. Okay. Well, to Cain, hey, you're not even going to be able to farm. But what would this do to Cain but require him then to live by the mercy of God? Because where does the food come from that he's going to eat? Oh, it's going to be that which grows naturally, which is grown by God. You're going to wander and you're going to drift on the earth. Very interesting. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to endure." And before we even go into the rest of it, consider Cain's point of view here. Cain has just murdered his brother, and God's immediate response is not, "I'm going to kill you because you killed your brother." Even though that is what is likely was deserved. Rather, he says, "Hey, you're going to be a wanderer on this earth and a drifter. You're not going to be able to cultivate the land anymore." And then Cain has the audacity to say to God, "No, no, no, that's too great. That's too great. That's too harsh, God. You just killed your brother, bud. Like, what do you expect?" And what I want you to see is really coming out step by step through this chapter is just the degradation of sin. He went immediately from, "Hey, I made an offering that wasn't pleasing to God, and that made me angry because my brother's offer was pleasing to God. So I'm going to go and kill my brother. I'm going to get sassy with God when he comes to ask me about it, and then I'm going to tell God he's being too harsh when he goes to punish me for my wrong." Okay, let's continue the narrative. "Behold, you have driven me you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and I will be hidden from your face, and I will be a wanderer and a drifter on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Okay. He's further blaming God. "You have driven me this day from the face of the ground." Hey, this is too harsh, God. I don't like this. I don't accept this punishment. Okay. "And I will be hidden from your face." Half true, half not true. Nothing can be hidden from God. But what he's saying is, I will be hidden from your blessings, basically. Okay. If Adam and Eve hadn't wandered far from the garden, well, now Cain is going to have to go pretty far from the garden because he's going to have to go wherever food is. He can't just set up shop anywhere. He has to stay on the move. He's going to be nomadic. He won't be near to the garden of God, near to the throne of God. And then he says, "I'll be a wanderer and a drifter, and whoever finds me will kill me." This is interesting for a couple of reasons. Really, really, really interesting. On one hand, whoever finds me, who would that be? And that's a question that it's really hard to answer because either it has to be that God has created more human beings outside of just creating Adam and Eve, or or Cain knows that his siblings later on will come and avenge the blood of their brother Abel and kill Cain. Let's talk about those two just briefly here. The problem with the first one, the problem with the idea that God has created lots of other human beings outside of an Adam and Eve, makes the whole fall into sin um, a little bit tougher of a pill to swallow. Because if death entered through sin, because all sinned, as Romans will later talk about, if not all genuinely sinned, it wouldn't necessarily be right for all to die. If Adam fell into sin, but there were other human beings alive on the earth who didn't, it's sort of tough to see how we get from point A to point B with the idea that, hey, all die and that death is justified because sin is in the world. Um, so I tend to prefer the latter interpretation, which is that, hey, rightfully Cain deserves to die because he has shed blood. So perhaps it would be the later descendants of Adam and Eve who would kill him. But even in that, even in Cain's fear, there's an interesting layer to it. The idea that whoever finds me will kill me is a fear that they're going to be like him. You know, he's the first murderer really on the earth, but he's afraid that when he runs into other people down the line, they are going to do to him exactly what he did to his brother. And because of that, God is not fair or God is being too harsh. Which once again, to get into Cain's mind here, that you can see that just this slippery slope of degradation into his giving in to sin. He is clearly not the master of sin here. Sin is the master of him already. And then we get to verse 15. The Lord answers him. The Lord said to him, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him 7 times as much." And the Lord placed a mark on Cain so that no one finding him would kill him. Okay, a couple of things about this first. First off, God, I want to call it a game, but I don't want to think of it as something silly here, but God is wanting to stop a game before it starts. You know, as we've seen throughout a lot of human history, violence often begets more violence. You know, we can apply this at a small level or a big level. Small level, you go to a baseball game, someone gets hit with the ball by the pitcher. It's very natural then for the other team in the next inning to return the favor and hit one of their team's batters. You know, this whole idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Um, This is very common. There's a lot of conflict at the time of this recording going on between Iran and Israel. And honestly, it wouldn't matter what year I recorded this, there'd probably be a lot of conflict going on between Iran and Israel until God comes back. Um, but what we see is action, reaction. Someone does something over here, they do this to respond. You do this, we do this, yada, yada, yada. God here is cutting that off and saying, yes, what you did is wrong, but I'm not going to let someone do to you what you did to your brother. If anyone kills you, I will have vengeance on them 7 times as much. How do you kill someone 7 times over? I don't know. But the number 7 um, in there because it seems to indicate perfection or completion, that essentially that, look, they will get the full uh, justice of their punishment, which again is even sort of interesting because Cain here does not get the full punishment for his wrongdoing. Cain has done something exceptionally wrong, and God is very merciful towards him, which shows the character of God, that as much as God is just because he is, God is also very kind and merciful, because if it was me in God's position, I would have just cut Cain off right there. He would have been gone. You killed your brother, okay, you die. Like that's a very simple thing. Even our legal code, in the United States tries to follow those same sort of principles. If you take someone's life, it's one of the few things that you can be given the death penalty for. But then the Lord placed a mark on Cain. Now, this is interesting because I've been talking about the idea of behavior compared to identity. Cain's behavior was murder, his behavior was lying. But now, by God putting a mark on Cain, now his identity as this murderer, this wanderer, this drifter has been placed on him so that he will know it, but also that everyone else who sees him will know it. For them, so that they will know, hey, don't touch him, don't kill him. But no matter where he goes, he's not going to be able to hide who he is now. His behavior, in essence, has now become his identity, which is very, very interesting. Then Cain left the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This verse here gives some credence to some of the stuff I talked about at the beginning of this chapter. That it's very likely that Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, when they left the garden, when they started to set up shop, that they stayed as close to the presence of God as they could, because He's their shelter. He's the one who knows everything. But now Cain is forced to venture away. And so he settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He didn't have to pick a very complicated name because no other names are really taken yet. So Nod works. That's a really sad joke. Let me make it even worse. The idea of, yeah, that'll do. He nodded, and that's how he came up with the name. Um, Terrible joke. Please complain at me for him. I'm gonna keep making them anyways. Verse 17. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Okay, pause. Wife? Where does the wife come from? Once again, especially early Genesis, we have a lot of details just left out of the story. But somewhere along the way, either before he killed his brother or after he killed his brother, Cain got married to a woman. Where did that woman come from? Well, either if God had created other human beings, he could have taken a wife from there. But the much more likely one is that Adam and Eve had born children that were female, and Cain married his sister, which we would probably say ew to. But this sort of intermarriage or incest would have been very common at the time, because there really genuinely weren't other options. And if you ever are interested in the scientific, uh, the genetic ideologies behind how incest back then would not have created the same issues as incest now, there are plenty of resources out there to look into it, having to do with the genetic code and how genetic decay is actually what has made incest such a negative thing for the advancement of our species. that likely wouldn't have been the case back then. But I'll let you look into that on your own because I'm not too familiar with all of it. Um, but there's a good chance here that Cain had married his sister, and an unfortunate reality of the curse in chapter 3 was the curse of the woman was your desire will be for him, but he shall rule over you. Uh, Cain's wife had not murdered anyone. She had not necessarily done anything wrong, and yet she has to bear the consequence with Cain, and they have to leave the land. He has relations with his wife. She conceives, gives birth to uh, a boy by the name of Enoch. Now there are going to be two Enochs mentioned here early on in Genesis. This is the far less famous of the two. But even though he's less famous, Cain built a city and named the city Enoch after the name of his son. So you're going to find a lot of these early cities are going to be named after the people who founded them, which makes a lot of sense. If I were to found a city, there's a chance I would name it Cody or Hezekiah or something like that. Uh, because why not? So he builds a city and he names a city after his son. But even in that building a city, there's another layer here. He has been told by God that you are going to be a wanderer and a drifter on the earth. He wanders for a little bit and then he decides, you know what? No, I'm not. And he builds a city where he's going to settle in. Interesting, where you see just further levels of rebellion. Okay. So we're also going to keep account as we go through the next couple verses because we're going to see an interesting theme show up here in chapter 4, but then really continued in chapter 5. So Adam would have been the first generation. Cain the second generation, Enoch the third generation. Okay. Now to Enoch was born Irad, fourth generation, and Irad fathered Mehujael, fifth generation. Mehujael fathered Methushael, sixth generation, and Methushael fathered Lamech. Okay. God created the earth in 7 days. He told Cain in this chapter, if anyone kills you, I will take sevenfold vengeance upon him. And now we have the seventh generation from Adam through Cain, a man by the name of Lamech. Okay, this is where I keep saying this is where it gets interesting. It's been interesting, but here's another interesting layer to this. Lamech took two wives for himself. First example we get in the Bible of bigamy. Okay. The name of one was Ada, the name of the other Zillah. Okay. One of the first things we see about Lamech is that he doesn't care about the idea of being married to one woman. He's going to have twice as many for himself. Okay. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and have livestock. Okay, I don't have a ton of detail about a lot of this, but essentially, this guy ended up becoming an expert in nomadic living, in husbandry, all of that stuff. His brother name was Jubal. He was the father of those who play the lyre and flute. So he uh, he invented a lot of music, a lot of musical instruments. He was probably the first to really start to develop a lot of that. And then Zillah also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Okay, so Tubal-Cain figures out metalwork. So we're seeing a lot of these things that are really important to civilization being developed through Cain. Couple interesting layers to this. Um, these kind of things are really important to civilization. And we will see the people of God utilize all of these sorts of things, with livestock. I mean, the Israelites were known for being shepherds, even when they go down to Egypt before they were slaves. That was something they were experts in. Uh, David is known in many ways for his musical ability. And then bronze and iron, I mean, tools, weapons, all of those sorts of things have been used throughout generations, even by the people of God. But it's interesting that they developed, in this instance, away from the presence of God. And one of the things that makes that interesting, and something I'd encourage you to check into, there's an extra biblical work known as the Book of Enoch. And it's pseudepigraphal, which means it's likely not actually all written by Enoch, but it has enough credibility that biblical authors even quote from it at times. So there's certainly at least some truth to it. Uh, but it's very interesting to look into. What the book of Enoch has to say about this little period in history was that there were many fallen angels who came down, and one of the ways that they would, as we'll get to in Genesis 6, where the sons of God came into the daughters of men, one of the ways that they would really start to entice or start to make their way into these groups of people was by revealing to them otherwise hidden information, including metalworks, things like that, that said, hey, if you try this, it'll do this. Like even the idea of makeup is mentioned in the book of Enoch, that this angel came down and he taught the women how to make themselves look as presentable as possible, as enticing as possible. So that's an interesting thing to check into. But the even more interesting part of it comes here in verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Pay attention to my words, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Okay. Lamech is the 7th from Adam on the side of Cain, 7th of Adam through Cain. And he has now taken the great shame of his father. Okay, the great shame of Cain, the mark for being a murderer, and he has turned it into a badge of honor. I've killed a man for wounding me. I've killed a boy for striking me. I'm strong. I'm tough. I have 2 wives, and if Cain is avenged 7 times, then hey, mine is, 11 times that much. So what we really see in a broader narrative here is that 7 generations from Adam on the side of Cain, who was the one who obeyed sin, we have this man who is just seemingly despicable. He's a warlord, in a sense that he he doesn't care about God's ideas for marriage. He doesn't care about the value of life. He's just a really evil person. And then to close out the chapter, we're going to see the alternative route. So we've got the 7th generation from Adam through Cain on one side, but now we're going to go elsewhere. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another child in place of Abel because Cain killed him. Okay. The act of Cain in murdering his brother was not a secret to his family. They knew about it. And they have another son here, and they name him Seth. Now they're going to have lots of other sons and daughters. That's going to be mentioned, but this son Seth is mentioned for a specific narrative reason, which is what I'm alluding to, which is what we will get to in chapter 5. Because just as 7 generations from Adam through Cain, we get Lamech, who is very wicked. 7 generations from Adam through Seth, we're going to get a man by the name of Enoch, who's going to be very righteous. But the chapter closes out here in verse 26. To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now here's let's call it challenging passage. I don't have a lot of answers to. It's a very tough phrase to try to get. Um, because what does it mean to just call upon the name of the Lord? We've already seen Cain and Abel trying to offer sacrifice to the Lord. But I think part of the idea we're getting here, separated into a couple of parts, calling upon the name of the Lord is because the people are spreading out, which is in many ways righteous. It's what God told them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Uh, but also with where it is in this chapter, it's a very good chance that this is just contrasting the works of Cain and what they were focused on compared to the works of Seth and what he's focused on. Okay. People began to call upon the name of the Lord. Cain's descendants were focused on earthly innovation, a lot of that kind of stuff, just earthly building a city, all of that. But Seth's descendants are going to be focused on the worship of God. And these two things we're going to find as the chapters move ahead are going to be in great conflict with one another. But that'll be another episode for another day. So I thank you for tuning in and look forward to seeing you next time, hopefully sooner rather than later. God bless.